Part 2. This time we enter the second part of Marshall Peak. Remember to subscribe if you have not done so, give us a like and activate the bell to receive all the updated content that we bring to you. Without further ado, let's begin. Continuing with the previous story. We see the protagonist training, and he thinks that ever since the golden skeleton entered his body, his strength has increased, and walking 20 miles with a sack of rice doesn't affect him in the slightest. But when he begins his training to cultivate his tempered body realm, the pressure is so intense that it seems as if heaven and earth are crushing him. However, he knows that only then can he overcome his limits and discover his true potential. The problem is that his recovery is so extreme that he can only train for half an hour a day. It's hard enough, but you also don't feel tired after all those punches and kicks. How can you push yourself to the limit if you don't feel exhausted? Furthermore, the protagonist is poor and only has 12 contribution points in the High Sky Pavilion. But he doesn't give up. As he dines on his simple meal of rice, he realizes that he has a solution. The Black Book. Each page contains something valuable, and he hopes to discover something even more valuable on the following pages. Then, he came across a golden incense burner that could help him in his training, as long as he had the right herbs. Unfortunately, these herbs are hard to find and contain toxins, but the protagonist is willing to risk everything and search Black Wind Mountain for them. Who knows what else you will find on your adventure? The next morning, you are up early and ready to continue on your path to perfection. The protagonist is ready to make the most of his day. He sets off with the Tempered Body Realm Fist, but it turns out to be a more difficult task than he thought. Despite having an impact on his cultivation, he only managed to perform 20 times before he had excruciating pain in his back. After his training, he takes up sweeping, but that's an easy task for him thanks to his golden skeleton. Then, he heads to the contributions room to learn about medicinal herbs. And guess what? The old man Meng gives him a book on herbs. What luck! Although it only has information on ordinary grade herbs, it is enough for what you need right now. With his permits approved, the protagonist heads to Black Wind Mountain, which is only 20 miles from his home. You are already familiar with the area and make sure you are fully prepared before you leave. The mountain is imposing, with a lush and diverse range of grasses. He ventures out to collect them and is surprised to discover that the mountain is like a prehistoric monster lying between heaven and earth. He feels the mountain breeze and it comforts him. With his knowledge of the terrain, he carries water, food, and tools with him, ready to gather herbs in the safe zone. After a while of searching, he finds a bunch of lychee herbs' sharp teeth. But as sunset comes, he feels a little tired and decides to rest under a tree and eat a little to regain his strength. After a tireless day of searching, the protagonist had found 78 herbs and 2 spirit flowers, but was still missing what he needed to activate the incense burner. Night fell, and although I was not tired, I was terribly hungry. Unfortunately, there was no hunting or shops around, and the few berries he found were very bitter. Then, he saw fire in the distance and walked towards it. As he approached, 2 people with bows took aim at him, but he was not intimidated. He explained to them that he was just collecting herbs and luckily, they accepted it. It turned out that the tall man and the boy were friendly and shared their fire with him. Seeing his thin, bony body, the tall man felt sorry for him and they began to talk and get to know each other better. The protagonist spoke to them a bit about his own history and the tall man was impressed that he was a disciple of the High Sky Pavilion. After a fun talk, the protagonist's stomach began to protest and the boy took out some rations of bread. Despite the fact that the protagonist tried to reject them, he could not resist eating them. The 3 of them spent the night together, slept around the fire, and luckily everything went peacefully. The next morning, the protagonist left some herbs as thanks and left in silence. After half an hour of training, he reached the 5th stage of the Tempered Body Realm. He was very happy to feel that incredible sensation again and was grateful to the golden skeleton and the Tempered Body Realm Fist. The protagonist knows that he has achieved twice as much with the Tempered Body Realm Fist and his cultivation speed is impressive, his development is impressive and he thinks that if he could practice longer without restrictions, who knows what he might become. After a brief pause, our hero continues on his quest for herbs, hunting down a plump rabbit and collecting more than 20 different types of herbs. Unfortunately, while your journey has been fruitful, you have yet to find the 2 main herbs you traveled for. On the way back to the High Sky Pavilion, the protagonist hears some desperate screams. As he gets closer, he realizes that they are the father and son from the night before, and they are undoubtedly in trouble. Our hero can't ignore this situation after the kind night he spent with them. He arrives at a dark cave, and without thinking twice, he jumps into action. The cave is covered in cobwebs, and there's something sinister in there. After hearing a strange sound, he discovers a tall man trapped in a cocoon. The man asks him to save his son, who has been kidnapped by a demon spider beast. The protagonist goes further into the cave, looking for the child. With the knowledge of the beast he is facing, his movements become more cautious. He eventually finds the boy, but also the demon spider beast, which is draining his blood. The protagonist doesn't have time to come up with a plan, and he jumps at the spider to save the boy. The spider becomes enraged and jumps on him. The spider was furious and began to attack the protagonist with its 8 hairy legs, but he reacted quickly and struck her in the throat to stun her. After that first meeting, the protagonist and the spider sized each other up and seemed impatient. The spider launched a silk thread to attack, but the protagonist managed to dodge it. However, the spider covered the entire cave with its silken thread. It was win or die for the protagonist. After an intense fight, and already weakened, with great injuries, the protagonist threw a punch into the spider's eyes and seriously injured it. The spider tried to escape, but could not. The protagonist punched him again and pulverized 2 more eyes. The spider screamed in pain, but the protagonist didn't stop and kept fighting until he defeated it. Despite having horrible injuries, he managed to kill her. Then, he saved the boy who was trapped in the cave and full of cobwebs and healed him using his knowledge of medicinal herbs. But the protagonist told the hunter that the herbs are only to relieve the symptoms, that he must seek a doctor or his life will be in danger. And the hunter replied that he would take him immediately. The hero told him to wait until his son's condition improved. The hunter looked at the protagonist's wounds and asked him, "Salvador, won't you treat your wounds?" And Yang Kai replied that it wasn't necessary, but thanks for caring. Despite having lost a lot of blood, the protagonist felt great and excited, as if his fight with death had empowered him. Then the protagonist sees some herbs and goes into a cave to collect them and finds a large number of purple flowers, which were just what he needed. Then, find a red mushroom and who knows? It could be a priceless treasure. So he picks it up and leaves the cave with his bag full. The hunter gratefully accompanies him on his journey down the mountain. But the brave protagonist diverts it, saying that it is only a shared path. Finally, they reached the town and looked for a doctor to help the boy. The protagonist, after helping a sick child, was thrown out of the doctor for being too loud. But, thanks to his help, the boy survived, and the hunter was eternally grateful, kneeling before him. However, the protagonist did not want anything in return and only asked the hunter not to kneel before him. The next day, many disciples gathered in the protagonist's small cabin to challenge him, but he did not appear. How weird. Maybe he was resting after an exciting battle that nearly killed him. Some of the disciples felt a little bad for him, but still wanted to challenge him. No one knows where he is, and there are some disciples waiting to challenge him. Enter Master Su, who is a handsome young man but with a gloomy face. Upon learning of the protagonist's situation, he rejoices at his suffering and wants to make him leave the High Sky Pavilion. After being insulted by Yang Kai, Sumu decided it was time to teach him a lesson and summoned some of his disciples to help him. However, when the other disciples decide to stay and watch the fight, Sumu gives them a clear order: make the others leave. Tell everyone that Yang Kai is mine today. But it turns out that not everyone knows Sumu's identity, and some dare to question her authority. Then someone whispers to them, "Don't you know who Sumu is? You idiot!" In the sect there is an elder with the same surname Su. There is also a core disciple within the top 10 with the same surname. Don't you get it? So although some were confused at first, they eventually realized who Sumu is and left. Sumu waited impatiently, wondering where the hell is that guy? But they couldn't find him at his place of work, so they decided to check his cabin. When they arrived, they weren't surprised to see how miserable he was, but that didn't stop Sumu from being arrogant. He yelled with all his might, "Yang Kai, get your ass out and come face me, I'll give you a good beating," but there was no response. No matter how long he waited, there was no sign of the protagonist. He had escaped? Was he hiding? Sumu sent someone to investigate, and it turns out that the hut was empty and full of dust. It seems Yang Kai has been missing lately and people don't seem to know where he is. But that's not the most interesting thing. Sumu, a wise man, has been trying to find him to get his revenge. However, after so long without any luck, he feels dissatisfied and decides to burn down Yang Kai's hut. Sumu is sure that even if the sky falls apart, he will be there to catch it. And that ragged hut only hurts his eyes, so it's not a major loss. Just as he is about to throw the torch into the cabin, someone behind him asks what he is doing. Sumu turns around and the person turns out to be the main character, Yang Kai himself. But everyone thinks that he looks like a real beggar, with torn clothes, messy hair, and plants growing out of his head. Plus, he's covered in blood and smells like a cross between a slaughterhouse and a latrine. Sumu is terrified by the protagonist's appearance and goes on guard, but eventually recognizes his voice and shouts, "Yang Kai!" Sumu was furious and wanted to beat Yang Kai mercilessly. But the protagonist was not intimidated and calmly entered his cabin. He put away his valuable herbs and went out again to face Sumu, who wanted to intimidate the protagonist and told him to kneel before him and call him as his elder if he wanted to spare his life. But Yang Kai did not give up and stood his ground against Sumu's threat. Instead of accepting, the protagonist explains to Sumu why he is wrong in his request, showing that he does not have enough power in the sect to be considered a true elder. The protagonist mentions that Sumu has an older sister who is a core disciple and that if she called him elder, she wouldn't know how to refer to him. The protagonist mentions that it is a serious mistake to call him an elder and that if he were an elder of Sumu's family, he would send him to the spiral dragon stream. Although Sumu is not afraid of Yang Kai, the name of the coiling dragon stream terrifies his soul, as it is the most dangerous place in the sect. One of Sumu's companions goads him into venting his anger on Sumu. It tells you that the difference in stages can't be more than 3 levels. It turns out that our friend Sumu understood this perfectly, because the truth is that he could not face the protagonist due to the great difference in strength. But of course, that didn't stop him from trying to humiliate him in front of everyone else. Sumu, with her face filled with hate and a cold smile, addressed the prototype who had only reached the 3rd stage of the tempered body realm, trying to make him feel inferior, and everyone laughed loudly. But then a disciple named Zhao offered to fight against Yang Kai, trying to curry favor with Sumu. But the protagonist was unimpressed, as the information they had on his cultivation level was out of date. If they had been aware of his progress in the last 5 days, they would know that he is now at a much higher stage. But instead of flaunting his power, the star decided to keep it a secret so as not to attract too much attention. Zhao Hu, on the other hand, kept insulting and belittling him, telling him that he would only allow him 3 moves and if he couldn't push him back, he would be considered a loser. The truth is, the difference between the 3rd and 5th stages of the temperate body realm is huge, like comparing a river to a stream. But despite that, the protagonist was not intimidated and accepted the challenge earnestly, remembering Zhao Hu's name. But no one bet a peso on the protagonist. Even Xia Ningchan, who was watching from a tree, thought that he would take a beating. But the protagonist fighting at no disadvantage, so he faced his opponent, Zhou, who laughed at him for his thin and weak body. The protagonist had an ace up his sleeve, an incredibly fast and strong fist. With just 2 punches and 1 kick, he defeated Zhou, who was writhing on the ground in pain and knocked out. All the onlookers gasped, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Following this, Xia Ningchan, who knew that the protagonist had a record of 147 losses, was stunned and momentarily lost concentration, falling from a tree and hitting his butt. But thanks to his quick reflexes, he was able to break his fall. Although equally, his buttocks burned. On the other hand, the other viewers were surprised by the strength of the protagonist, who seemed to have increased drastically in just a few days. Sumu, who was in shock, accused the protagonist of cheating. But there was no catch. Zhou Hu had declared that he would receive all 3 attacks, and the protagonist simply showed his strength. He even felt a bit dissatisfied, knowing that he had not reached his full strength. The disciples then tell Su Mu that it seems that the information they had about Yang Kai was not entirely correct. It turns out that this boy was not at the 3rd stage of the tempered body realm, but at a higher stage. Master Su could not believe it. He thought that Zhou Hu had underestimated the protagonist and that, if he had fought seriously, he would have been victorious. But hey, it's done, and the boy took his well-deserved victory. Su Mu was furious and promised that next time, the protagonist would not be so lucky. But this one doesn't care. Meanwhile, in the protagonist's cabin, everything had returned to calm, although he was a little depressed for having lost valuable training time. But, like any good warrior, he decided that it was best to take a bath to relax and recover. While the protagonist was bathing in the pond, Xia Ningqian, a very curious disciple, decided to sneak up to see what the protagonist's true training level was. But when she turned the corner, all she saw was a bare white butt, which shocked her. Although her training level was high, she had never seen anything like this before. And, of course, his first thought was, this is too much. Why is fate playing this trick on me? Then the protagonist had to do his daily chores, and he continued with his tasks, completing his job of sweeping the assigned area. Before leaving, he decided to take out the herbs he had collected and leave the ones that were of no use to him in his bag. And, for some reason, he decided to put on his blood-stained clothes and mess up his hair, perhaps to appear a bit more tough or experienced. Then the protagonist went to visit Treasurer Meng, who was enjoying his morning tea and humming a cheerful song. But suddenly, a strange figure entered the room. It turns out that it was the main character, who had returned from a trip to the Black Wind Mountains and looked more like a ghost than a human being. But, as always, Meng maintained her legendary calm and asked what had happened. The protagonist explained that he had been through some difficulties, but at least he had found some herbs and wanted to know if the contributions room would accept them. The herbs were lower level, but Meng couldn't resist the expression in the protagonist's eyes and decided to accept them and give him some contribution points. After all, he knew that this young man worked hard despite his lack of natural talent. But while talking to Treasurer Meng about his latest expedition, the protagonist took a bag out of his backpack and told him in a low voice that he had found something incredible. Treasurer Meng turned serious and cautiously asked what it was. The protagonist took out of the bag a mushroom of considerable size, dark red in color and with a heavenly and earthly aura that made it seem very valuable. Meng couldn't believe her eyes because the porter had faced a demon beast. However, he thought that it would be disappointing for the protagonist to know that the Neo mushroom was worth a lot, so he told him that it was a very good find and that the mushroom was of a lower level earth grade. The protagonist was pleasantly surprised and asked how many points it was worth. The treasurer, trying to maintain his reputation, firmly stated that he could give him 20 points. But the protagonist thought he deserved more points for her. Even though he had a lot of accumulated points, he knew that cultivation was the most important thing and he didn't want to be too greedy. Then, he decided that he needed more dead Jedi tree herb for his cultivation and asked Treasurer Meng for 10 of them. However, the old man offered him a higher price than it was supposed to be and the protagonist got annoyed with him accusing him of earning extra points. The protagonist was upset and accused Meng of buying low and selling high. But the treasurer reminded him that he was just a middleman and the prices were assigned by the sect. After all, it is the way the 3,000 disciples are provided for. The protagonist ended up buying 10 herbs from the dead Jedi tree. And while he lost a lot of points in the process, at least he got what he needed. Coming out of the contribution room, Yang Kai ran into a mysterious girl wearing a mask. And although he couldn't see her face, Yang Kai could tell that she was quite shy. The poor girl turned so red when she ran into Yang Kai that she rushed off without even raising her head. Xia Ningqian then entered the contributions room and told the treasurer that he had been making a breakthrough and asked him about his injury, but the treasurer told him not to worry as he had it under control. In another scene, the protagonist was excited because he would finally be able to use the herbs he had gathered. And they were not few. He had enough for a while. She then put the herbs in the incense burner and a unique aroma began to fill the room. But the thing did not stop there, because the aroma spread through the holes of the incense burner and entered the protagonist's body through his nostrils, as if they were snakes crawling in the air. So, the protagonist left the hut and began his cultivation. But after only a few steps, his feet felt like they were made of lead and his strength diminished rapidly. It seemed that the atmosphere energy that he had learned was affecting him. Taking the third step, he fell to the ground, and he had barely left his cabin. The protagonist remained motionless on the ground, his body writhing in pain. What was happening? It turns out that the side effects of the herbs began to affect his brain. The toxicity of the herbs was not very strong, but in combination with his physical state, he was unable to resist them. Finally, after fighting with all his might, the protagonist stands up. His legs are shaking and his body is exhausted, but he has managed to break through his limits. Although his mind and body were tired, a warm sensation burst within him, making him feel as if he was being bathed in the most refreshing rain after a long drought. And that's not all, his body became stronger than ever before. It seems that the golden skeleton has a few tricks up his sleeve, but it will only work when his body and mind are pushed to the limit. That is, if he gives up before then, there is no help for him. This incense burner is quite the challenge. It smells delicious, but it can leave you like a broken dam. You have learned an important lesson: if you want to be stronger, you will have to constantly push yourself and never give up. But, in another scene we have the villain of this story, Sumu. His pride has been severely hurt by the fact that the protagonist defeated his group, and this keeps him awake at night thinking about his revenge. Now, Sumu is itching for revenge and can't wait to challenge the protagonist again. He even wakes up his subordinates in the middle of the night to plan his revenge. And here is the second part of this incredible story. Remember that if you liked it, I invite you to subscribe and like this video, as well as hit the bell to receive all the updated content that we upload every day. What did you think of the summary? I invite you to leave it in the comments. Until our next video.